Today we are speaking with Ann L. Bateson, who is Professor of Law and Associate Dean and Director of the Schoenecker Law Library at the University of St. Thomas in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Ann, it's sort of customary as we begin these conversations to ask you about your life, both when you were young and perhaps today.
Well, I'm a Minneapolis person all the way. I was born in Minneapolis about 1945 and actually lived my childhood in an apartment complex that's walking distance from downtown Minneapolis.
Mm-hmm.
The complex, or the unit that I lived on, the block that I lived on, had 8 3-story, relatively low-income apartments. And my mother, my 2 brothers, an uncle, and I shared a basement apartment where 4 of us, my mother and I and 2 brothers, slept in one small bedroom. My uncle slept on a cot in a living room, and my guess is the apartment wasn't more than 500 square feet.
Wow.
What I remember most was hating how small it was. There was never a place where you could go and get away, and there certainly wasn't a place where you could study in quiet, and I liked to study in quiet.
Mm-hmm.
But although the apartment was small and not too wonderful, the neighborhood was really wonderful because it really was a neighborhood. Most people knew each other. Everybody's families welcomed everybody else's children into their homes. There was always someone to play with. And although we didn't have any yard space on that crowded block of apartment buildings, there was a wonderful park right across the street where you could always catch a game of softball, ice skate in the winter, and there was a neighborhood school there. So the total picture growing up was of growing up in a low-income, low-working-class neighborhood, but a neighborhood where everybody was similarly situated and quite happy. So I went to the local public school as a grade school person, but transferred to the parish Catholic school for 7th and 8th grade because my mother was worried about how tough the local junior high school was. Tough in terms of children's behavior, and maybe rightly so. After 8th grade at the local Catholic high school, I transferred to St. Margaret's Academy, an all-girls Catholic high school, and it was an outstanding school in terms of quality of education. That was also the place where I discovered everybody was not from the same socioeconomic class, as most of the girls there were from far wealthier families than I was. I worked most of my childhood. I started with paper routes when I was a young kid, babysitting and paper routes with my brother. I sold magazines door to door. I worked my way through the Catholic high school by doing a work-study job that paid half the tuition, and I was a long-distance phone operator after school and during summer. So I had a childhood that had a mix of work and play and seriousness of purpose. I remember particularly when I was a sophomore in high school when my mother and uncle had saved enough money to make a down payment on a duplex, and for the first time we were able to move to a real house with 2 bedrooms and an attic, so there was getaway space, and I had a quiet place to study, and I absolutely loved that. I, as I said, lived in Minneapolis most of my life, and part of the reason for that is I'm a caregiver for my mother who has Alzheimer's. My 2 children and my 3 grandchildren all lived in Minneapolis. So I was never tempted to look at careers very far away. And I've been very fortunate to be able to hold 2 library directorships right in the city in which I was born.
Right.
And I've been very lucky eventually to design and build my dream house, and to have a lake home where I can swim and canoe and play with my grandchildren only 2 hours from the Twin Cities.
Oh, that sounds wonderful.
So life is good.
Yeah.
Life is good.
Could you tell us a little bit about your education? Actually, you mentioned everything up to when you started college, which you didn't.
In my college years, I was a sister of St. Joseph, so I was in what folks would call the nunnery. So in that sense, your college was picked for you. So I attended college at the College of St. Catherine in St. Paul, Minnesota, where the mother house for my order was located, and I went through all 5 years of college as a nun. Well, it was 5 years because we took a lot of theology courses
I'm sure.
in addition to other courses. St. Kate's was a wonderful place to go to school, but my college years were not socializing years as they are for many folks in college. After my time at St. Kate's, I spent some time being a high school history teacher because that's what I was educated to do. And I didn't return to school until I left the convent. And when I decided to leave the convent, I think I had sense enough to know that my friends would not be in the same positions in which I left them 6 years earlier. And I thought it would be a good idea to put myself in an environment where I would meet new people and learn new things. And school seemed like a perfect environment. So that's when I decided to go to library school. And I actually picked library school because when I had been a history major at St. Kate's, many of my classmates had double majors, history and library science.
Mm.
And the girls in the library science program loved that program, and I always remembered that. And after I graduated from the University of Minnesota Library School, I got lucky in the sense that I was almost handed a job on a silver platter. I had recently really overworked the library school project and paper. And the dean of the journalism school at the University of Minnesota called the library school seeking recommendations for good librarians. And my name came to the top of the list, I guess. So I got a job relatively easily. And then spent 4 years working in a journalism library. But along the way, after about 4 or 5 years there, I thought it was a one-person library. And my own assessment was I had taught myself everything I could teach myself.
Mm.
So I decided it was time to get a subject master's degree. And I decided to go get a law degree. And I probably had 3 reasons for that. One was even as a high school student, I'd wanted to be a lawyer. But in my day, women weren't lawyers.
That's right, we're still ahead of the curve.
But that idea kept coming back to me. It probably especially came back to me because during the stretch when I worked in the journalism library, I also had an opportunity to take a year's leave of absence to follow my husband who had been drafted. And during that year, I worked in a public library. And during that year, I read what I think at the time was almost all the feminist literature, which again sparked the idea that perhaps I really could be a lawyer. And then third, while I was working in the journalism library, I worked with Don Gilmore, who was a national expert on mass communication law. And I decided that to keep up with him, I should go take George Grossman's legal bibliography course at the U of M Law School. So I did, and I thought I could do this. So eventually I went to the U of M Law School. So 3 degrees, St. Kate's for the first and the University of Minnesota for the library science and law degrees.
Now, you sort of evolved your way into law librarianship. You've come through George's course, and now you're at the university. Did anyone play a particular role in helping you come to that decision?
Actually, yes. In addition to my St. Kate's library school friends who made me think about library science as a whole, after I graduated from law school and had worked for a time in a more law-related profession, I actually got a call from Tom Loxlin one day. Tom was associate director at the University of Minnesota Law Library, and he wanted to encourage me to apply for an open position at the U Law Library. He also had Matt Downs, who was library director at William Mitchell College of Law, call me and encourage me to apply for a reference position at that library. So the outreach of those two folks eventually led me back to librarianship and specifically into law librarianship. So outreach does matter.
Must have sounded like a very attractive profession with all these jobs dangled in front
There
of you.
were, there seemed to be plenty of jobs in those days and not enough people to fill them. So people were doing active recruiting, and I benefited from that because I landed in a profession that's been a wonderful profession for me.
Yeah, well, I share that sentiment entirely, and I too came along about that vintage, and there were a lot of opportunities open for us quickly.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Let's talk about some of those jobs. You mentioned you came here to the University of Minnesota and as reference librarian.
I've worked for 6 different employers in my professional existence, starting with being a high school teacher because that's what I did as a nun. But I didn't particularly care for high school teaching and decided, as I said, to return to library school after I left the convent. Then, as I said, I kind of had a job fall in my lap at the University of Minnesota Journalism School. And that was a good professional job because it was a one-person show and because I was a new professional. I don't think I did anything unique there, but I know I provided a lot of good service. And I was very happy doing that, and I learned how to be self-sufficient, and I learned how to draw on my colleagues. So if I had a reference question that I couldn't answer, I'd pick up the phone and call a colleague at the main university library, identify myself, and say, "Can you help me out?" And of course, you always got wonderful help. After working at the journalism library, as I said, when my husband was drafted, I had an opportunity to work in a public library, and I never thought I would want to do that. I was always going to be an academic librarian. But I had a wonderful opportunity to run a branch library for a little over a year. And there I had the opportunity to inaugurate a book talk program aimed at mothers when they brought their children to Story Hour. And also to do book talk programs for the military wives on the military bases. The idea wasn't mine. It came from a very progressive, older library director, but I had a lot of fun implementing it, and it meant every week I could pick a theme, I could pick a topic. You know, I could start with programs on how to use the library to find your family, or to plan your family vacation, and then I could read all the feminist literature and talk to folks about thinking about what they wanted to do with their own lives in a professional sense. So that was one of my first creative projects, implementing a pretty good public library book talk system. After law school, when I went to work as a lawyer, I went to work as a deputy reviser of statutes for the Minnesota Reviser of Statutes office. Actually, I started out as an assistant reviser drafting laws and worked my way into a deputy reviser of statutes position. I was actually hired in that attorney position because I was a librarian in addition to being an attorney. At that stage, the reviser wanted someone who could advise him on improving the index to the regular official version of Minnesota statutes. He knew the index was weak, but he didn't know what to do about it, and he thought a library could help. So in that position, I had the joy of, first of all, learning to be a good technical legislative drafter. I managed to convince them that the official Minnesota statutes needed a good preface that would tell users how to use it, what the abbreviations in the tool meant, something that would be obvious to any librarian, but not necessarily obvious to anybody else. So I was able to improve the official publication of Minnesota statutes. One of my creative ideas there that I've always been proud of is I always thought most legislative drafting was terrible, and most new drafters tried to learn drafting by imitating bad old drafting. And I managed to convince the reviser that we should, in effect, hire a PhD grammarian who could help make our drafts readable, plain English. The Minnesota Revisor's Office may be the only revisor's office in the country that has a position like that. And then also when I worked in the revisor's office, the Minnesota legislature decided that Minnesota administrative rules need to be handled much more centrally and published much more efficiently. Until the time that the revisor's office was assigned a project to fix that situation, every agency had published its own rules. They only published them when they had the money to do so because the money came out of their own budgets. So publication was irregular and nobody had a good collection of all administrative rules. So along the way, I became the first editor of a Minnesota administrative rules publication, which basically mimicked the Minnesota statutes in terms of quality of drafting, quality of organization, and frequency of publication. So I had some good experiences in the revisor's office that I was able to have because of both my law and library science degrees. When I moved to William Mitchell, my first law library job, I started as a reference librarian, eventually became associate director, interim director, and then director. The most satisfying experience I had there, and it was incredibly satisfying, is I got to help plan, design, and furnish a major new academic law library in the 1990s. And I remember spending lots of, actually Sunday evenings, sitting in my office and moving bubbles around a large map to say what functions need to be next to each other and why. And the planning stages started in the late 1980s when technology hadn't completely taken over our lives yet. So we seriously had to think about how do you build a flexible library, both in terms of space? How do you build a functional library in terms of relationships? And how do you build a library that will allow you to adopt the technology of the future when you don't even know what that is yet? And I've had a great deal of satisfaction because of all of the libraries in town in terms of design and function. It's still my favorite library. I readily acknowledge that. And I think it's really stood the test of time. One of the things we did, I managed the contract for all of the furnishings in the library. And one of the things we did is we made it an almost all steel case law library. We bought ergonomic chairs not just for the computer labs, but for the whole place. I had a really good time negotiating that contract and was very proud of that accomplishment. That was probably my favorite accomplishment at William Mitchell. We also had a marvelous library dedication. We built the Warren E. Burger Library. We had 2 Supreme Court justices and many marvelous events surrounding that. But of course, I was there for about 24 years, so during that time we did a lot of other things too. Those were the years when most of us were automating law libraries for the first time. I think our library was the first one in the state of Minnesota to purchase the innovative interfaces system. We were very proud of that. During those years, we put up the first professional-looking library website. We really strengthened faculty services. We got heavily involved in teaching legal research and assisting faculty in whatever other research instruction they were interested in. So all told, 24 really good years, and I left behind a library that I was incredibly proud of, a collection that I was incredibly proud of, and a staff that I was really very proud of.
Sounds like quite an achievement. A good 24 years.
Yeah, it was a good 24 years. I moved to St. Thomas. I wasn't looking for a new job, but I got asked to interview for the job, and the first time I said no, and they went through a search, and it was a failed search, and the dean called again and said, "Can I talk you into reconsidering?" And I think I facetiously said, "Well, let's have lunch, because if I don't like you and you don't like me, we can end this really fast." And we did like each other, and I'm a Catholic, and St. Thomas is a Catholic law school, committed to a Catholic mission. And at the time, my thinking was, it's a good way to cap a career. Being part of an institution that you feel part of in both an intellectual and spiritual way. And it's been a good move for me. It's brought new challenges, because librarianship right now is bringing new challenges. And actually, I'm very proud of what we've accomplished so far there. From the beginning, I decided we needed to restructure the staff to take account of changes, particularly in legal publishing and automation. The move from very much a paper library to an electronic library. So we restructured the staff. We managed to keep all of the resources what we needed, but to eliminate duplicate purchases where we didn't need things. And most of all, my marching orders when I came to St. Thomas were, I want you to ratchet up faculty services. St. Thomas is strongly committed to a highly intellectual, scholarly model for its faculty, and the dean wasn't sure what the library was doing for the faculty. I think one of my biggest accomplishments is I can clearly say the dean has no doubt about what we're doing for the faculty these days.
Well, it's important to serve those faculty needs, but it's also important to make sure everybody knows that you're doing so.
The concept of marketing is an incredibly important concept. Most of my librarians of my generation were probably not trained in it. But it's really true. You have to learn how to appropriately and modestly but effectively let the community know what you're doing for community members. And we do a lot of original research for our faculty. We document and summarize sources that we find. We've helped them edit books. We index their publications. We teach research units in their classes when they ask us to. The amount of support has been significant, and I think has really helped the productivity of the faculty as a whole. And I'm very proud of that.
Well, it sounds like you should be. I mean, it's a tremendous need that the faculty has.
It is, and it takes a lot of good people working together to do it. No one person makes a library successful, but any one person can make it unsuccessful relatively quickly. So the importance of building a team where you don't expect everybody to have all skills, but expect everybody to share skills and capitalize on each other's strengths, I think, is incredibly important.
Now, you have done things outside of the library, the ones in which you work with our associations. I know that you were president of the Minnesota chapter of the American Association of Law Libraries at one point. You've been involved with the American Bar Association, Association of American Law Schools, library portions of those. You want to talk a little bit about some of that activity?
I think over the years I've done it all, as the saying goes, but not all at the same time. And at different stages I've done more of some kinds of professional work than other kinds of professional work. So yes, I've chaired the Minnesota Association of Law Libraries, where I was particularly proud of focusing people's attention on the interpersonal skills required for success in librarianship, or any profession for that matter. And I did that largely through a series of columns that I wrote, focusing on really useful books to read about interpersonal relationships and skills in a work environment. I've spoken at both AALL and AALS meetings. I've planned a AALS program, and done many similar things like that. But what I'm really proudest of in terms of professional service is probably something that's not well known, but I'm proudest of it because it has lasting value in my judgment. Once when I was attending an ABA meeting, I had a conversation with Jim White, who was the consultant on legal education. And I proposed to Jim that the section on legal education establish a committee on law school administration that was designed to support associate and assistant deans. The deans were well taken care of and had their group, but there was no similar group for that next level of professional deans within law schools. Jim took the suggestion, he worked it through whatever mechanisms he needed to, and he created a committee on law school administration, made me the first chair of it, and in that capacity, among other things, I planned pretty much single-handedly a conference on law school administration held at Jackson Hole immediately following the development officers conference that the ABA sponsors biennially. And that conference has become a relatively frequent event. In addition to that, the Committee on Law School Administration eventually put together a listserv, very much like the Law Library Director's listserv, that's become, I think, the major communication vehicle among deans and associate deans in the country. So that probably is my proudest professional accomplishment because I think it is both relatively unique and of relatively permanent value.
Now, I know that many of our colleagues, we used to call ourselves, actually when I started, and you started, law librarians. That was the designation of the head law librarian. Later we became directors if we were academic libraries, or some others. Now it's associate dean for library and technology, or some variant on that, because the roles have in fact expanded. So when you were involved in beginning this new part of the ALS, or APA actually, with Jim White, did you include in that librarians as well as other types of associate and assistant deans?
Librarians are frequent participants in both the listserv and some of the activities. It wasn't aimed at librarians as a group, but it was aimed at inclusiveness for people who managed major parts of law schools. I think Cali is still the major organization of the technology folks, but I think the AALS section or committee on law school administration is one that more law library directors may want to look at because, of course, as both you and I know, we administer frequently not only libraries but technology, and some of us even moved into more general law school administration.
That's true. Many of us did in our careers, and we have a lot of the same skills needed for those positions as well.
Absolutely, and just building relationships with people who don't just work in your same functional area can be incredibly useful in being effective in your own functional area.
I suppose as librarians, we've had within our own organization and within the ABA and the ALS, library focused groups that provided some of this to us. But
Absolutely.
It sounds like this outreach in interrelationship with other types of administrative people.
It is another
helpful.
organization and committee which people could consider in their own professional development.
And the networking that we might develop would probably be very helpful as well.
Absolutely. I don't know about others of my colleagues, but my sense is many of us have served over the years on dean search committees, for example, and the contacts you make through some of these committee assignments and committee projects as well as through the site inspections that many of us do as part of our ABA service, are really invaluable in helping build pools of candidates and assess candidates who do apply.
Mhm.
It's been
I imagine,
wonderful
as
for
you
that
say,
group.
that would be a trade-off, a quid pro quo right quickly.
It's absolutely wonderful for
Yeah.
that. So I've truly enjoyed all of my service for the ABA,
Mhm.
and a lot of my librarian service has been done through the ABA and the AALS.
Now, you have also found some time to write.
I have.
You were one of the authors of The Process of Legal Research, which is now in its 8th edition. Could you talk a little bit about perhaps that publication and, things in publications in general?
Well, the process of legal research, I credit to my colleague Chris Coons, who came up with the original idea for the book. She had long thought that law students needed a book designed more for them than for librarians, and she viewed many of the traditional books that we all grew up on in the profession, the Bob Marion and the Roy Mirsky books, as more appropriate for librarians or as reference tools than as teaching tools for students.
Mm-hmm.
So the thought behind the process of legal research textbook was that we wanted to create something student-friendly that truly focused on the process of research rather than the bibliography
Mm-hmm.
of research. And we decided from the beginning to use a threefold approach. One, we would explain for the kinds of sources we would include the process by which one would pick them and use them. We would model the process by trying to create an interesting in-text problem, or for some edition, sets of problems. And then we would create research situations or problem sets, the terminology varied with us over the years, by which we would encourage students to try their hand at what we would explain and what we had shown. Over the years, and it's amazing because the field of legal research, the tools for legal research changes far more rapidly than most of us really even understand on a day-to-day basis, but it really became almost necessary to update that book about every 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
This last edition, the 8th edition that we just finished, is in some sense much simpler than any of the other editions. The goal was to make sure that students didn't miss the forest because of the proliferation of trees
Mm-hmm.
in our world. The goal was also to recognize that students came to us much more familiar with an online environment than they had in the past.
Mm-hmm.
So some of the explanation that past editions had used was no longer equally important. So that has always been quite a project. It's always been something that I knew I had to work on every 3 years or so. But in between and while working on that, and although writing a textbook is a relatively common academic activity, my biggest publication came out of an activity that is not at all a common academic
Mm-hmm.
activity. And that publication and that project involved recodifying the laws of Uganda. And that doesn't necessarily sound like a librarian project.
Yeah, I was intrigued when I saw that in your background, and I sort of was wondering about how you got involved in that, and
It's a fun story, even
Yeah.
from my own perspective. It's far more a librarian-type project than most people would realize.
uh-huh.
And it fell into my lap probably, again, because I was both a lawyer and a librarian.
Mm-hmm.
It came to me out of the blue. I was sitting in my office diligently working away one day and picked up a ringing phone, and the voice on the other end was from someone at West Publishing
Mm-hmm.
who knew me from my work in the revisor's office. The revisor's office worked with West because Minnesota statutes, and the Minnesota statutes annotated had to have the same coding and things like that. So he knew me from
Sure.
my work from those days, and I think his line was, "Are you sitting down? Have I got a deal for you?" And he said, "How would you like to go to Uganda?" And he explained that a consulting company was looking for names of people who might be qualified to assist USAID in determining if it would be possible to codify the laws of Uganda. And, I told him he could send off my resume, and I forgot about it and certainly didn't expect anything to come of it. I got another call about a month later saying, the thrust of it in my mind was, you have all the right technical qualifications, but you're a middle-aged white woman and you've never been to a third world country, right?
Mhm.
And I thought, I'm a manager, I get that. So I assumed again that it wouldn't be me. And the next call said, you are one of 3 finalists. They are choosing tomorrow. If they pick you, will you go? I thought I'd better mention this to the dean and my husband.
Sounds like there are people you do need to clue in on that one.
Yeah, and so the bottom
Side
line
trip.
is they did pick me, and they told me later, the choice was made by the Ugandan Ministry of Justice officials and USAID working together, and they told me they picked me because I was a librarian. And they knew they had trouble finding copies of their laws, and they figured if anyone could do that, a librarian could do that.
You would know how to go around and
Absolutely.
locate this stuff.
So I spent a month in Uganda,
Uh-huh.
and it was both an incredible personal and professional experience. It was a little daunting. I was in a totally new environment, not long after the Idi Amin days. Military people who had left the military walked through the parking lot of the hotel with machine guns in hand because they didn't take the armor away or the arms away when the soldiers were decommissioned. The country had all kinds of problems with both malaria and AIDS, so there were health issues. And then I had my first meeting with the Ministry of Justice officials and the USAID officials. And they indicated that the problem was serious and the task quite daunting because nobody had anything resembling a complete set of the laws of Uganda. Many of the copies had been destroyed during some of the Civil War days. Many others had been degraded in libraries where sometimes when there wasn't a working copier, it was easier to take a page from a book. So there were those normal kinds of situations. Sometimes the text of documents had been 3-hole punched and the punch came over a number, so you couldn't guess what the number was. So there were all kinds of issues. But the folks there were nice enough to have a Ugandan colleague appointed to work with me. She was a professionally trained drafter herself. And together we figured out that we could, first of all, create a checklist of all the statutes and statutory instruments by using the Ugandan Gazette. Again, a tool most librarians are familiar with because the Gazette listed all the statutes and statutory instruments published every month. In those days, I was able to go into Uganda with a rented laptop. I did not yet own one. But it was one of the few laptops available, and it enabled us to go from government printing office to university to private law offices, and we gathered all of the gazettes we could, took them back to my hotel room where we keyed data from 7 in the morning to midnight, about 7 days a week. And the long and short of it was, by the time I left, I knew something that we had done something incredibly meaningful. We had created a checklist of the laws of Uganda, with the possible exception of documents that appeared on 7 missing gazettes. And we also had determined where we could find about 1 copy of almost all the laws. So after I left, the Austrian government financed a reprinting of all those laws, so at least the court had copies, a complete set of the laws. And that work, that 1 month's work, made it possible to think seriously about a recodification. I hadn't realized as a consultant that if you do a good job on one task, you're likely to get asked to do another. So people kept asking if I would do the work of recodification.
Mhm.
Because I had worked in a revisor's office, I had some sense of the massiveness of the task. I also had learned that 4 other individuals or groups had failed at it when they had far fewer years to work with. But I finally said if my dean approved and if USAID would send my Ugandan colleague to work with me in Minnesota, where I could have some sense that we could protect the documents,
Mhm.
that I would do it. So 2 of us, with a crackerjack administrative assistant and the help of William Mitchell's word processing staff, basically spent 10 years updating the 1964 laws of Uganda through the year 2000. And we turned out a set of 28 volumes of 16,000 pages that were printed by the British government.
Mhm.
It was one of those projects that was all-consuming for 10 years. During those years, I did a few ABA inspections, updated my textbook when I had to.
Mhm.
But I worked pretty nonstop on that project. But it's one that both my Ugandan colleague and I are very proud of. And because I've been a librarian, I mean, I've had a chance to visit a foreign country that I never thought I would visit,
Mhm.
and to work on the kind of project that I never imagined I would be able to work on. I feel very, very fortunate about that.
Well, I know when I first saw that in your background, that something I'd never seen anywhere else in anybody else's background. It
There are
certainly
many
seemed-
people who have done a project like
Seemed
that.
unusual.
Yeah.
10 years, that's a
Yeah,
long
yeah.
chunk of time.
Well, you
Big
know,
commitment.
it had to be done in between all of the other things that you do as a
Mhm.
library director.
That's right, you
So-
still had your day job.
So
You
I
were being
still
a
had my
library
day
director.
job. It was my faculty scholarship and service project, but it required lots of nights, lots of weekends, lots of missed holidays.
Oh, I'm sure.
Yeah, it did.
Mhm.
It did. In the end, I would conclude it was worth it.
Well, Ann, as we sort of near the end of our conversation today, it's sort of customary for me to ask if there's anything that we have not talked about that you would like to bring up.
I think I would conclude by saying law librarianship is a wonderful, wonderful career. And academic librarianship in particular allows people with interests in law, in teaching, in librarianship, and in management to actually have a chance to work in all of those areas.
Mhm.
And to do so in an environment that's highly intellectually stimulating and that is quite flexible. In most of my jobs, I have felt that as long as you are contributing meaningfully to the institutional goals, you have a great deal of flexibility in deciding how you will contribute to those goals.
Mhm.
And that's quite a blessing.
Sounds like you've had a wonderful career, and it continues.
I
One
have.
of these days, you might decide it's time to retire. I recommend that when you're ready for it, but not until.
Not until. I have no idea when it will be,
Yeah.
but when it is, I will leave feeling I've done some good and I'm satisfied with what I've done.
Mhm. Well, I want to thank you for talking with us today, Ann, not only on my behalf, but also on behalf of Michelle Wu, Frank Hodak, and Dick Spinelli, with whom I have the privilege of being involved in the putting together of this oral history of law librarianship as told about and by ourselves and our profession. So with that, I'll thank you one last time.
And
Thank
good
you.
luck with the rest of your project.
Thank you.